You say it is a mild virus, and clearly looking at what's happening with ICU beds and hospitalization, that's holding true for India just as it did for South Africa and the United Kingdom. But there is one argument that because it is so infectious, even if a small number of people end up in hospital, our health system cannot take it. And if that small number hits our healthcare workers, our healthcare system will collapse. These are the two main concerns at this point. How do you respond to that?
Exactly. And that is what the worry I had early on. And I said I was initially worried. But as this picture unfolded, and it was very clear, the mildness. Now, I'm not going to argue this particular virus is a gentleman by nature. It so happens it arrived in the scene after several of the waves are gone through, people have been immunized. So I guess the virus had no option but to behave itself. So that is one possibility. When it's an interaction between virus and a human body, and both have a little to say on a bit to say in these matters. But unlike in the case of Delta, which was quite nasty virus, this one is coming along quite nicely. And the early signs are very, very promising. And we have to really be careful about it, but I think this is not going to trouble us seriously.
What about the healthcare workers? The one thing the public health system cannot afford is to have, let's say, 30% of its doctors isolating at home because they've tested positive for Omicron, whether they're symptomatic or asymptomatic. And I'll get to testing protocols in a moment from now. But given that it doesn't seem to be causing virulent disease, even so, if 10 days of isolation is mandatory, you could have a section of your healthcare workers, if infected in large numbers, knocked out of the system.
Barka, the problem is we all are ill with the coronaphobia. We are scared of the virus. And this particular isolation business is no more needed. It was not needed for a long time because the initial thrust was on getting rid of the virus, stopping it in its entry into India. We couldn't do it. Then we'll say we'll contain it. We couldn't do it. This is too infectious. And the one that followed Delta was even more infectious. So these infectious diseases, you can wish all you like to stop it. It can't. So these exercises that we go through, isolation, whatever the techniques we use, quarantine, nothing work. The thing is, it is worthwhile giving it a shot if it's a dangerous disease. Now that we know it hardly matters, I think the balance of things suggests that you just take care of the people who are frail, very elderly, immunosuppressed. They have probably the only thing they can do is to make sure they wear a double mask. The rest of the population, I would say, things are cool.
That's very, very promising. And I think it's just the kind of New Year news that a lot of people would have liked. But even so, I'm not going to stop with some counter questions, Mr. Muliyil. And let me start with the first one. The first question is, testing. During Delta and the first wave, there was a belief that you needed to test more and more and more and more. Given that prima facie Omicron seems to be, as you said, mild, especially for the vaccinated, would you say that if let's say you and I have no symptoms, should we be testing? Should the asymptomatic be testing?
There is a disease called COVID-related pneumonia to be managed in a good center with all the facilities. Those physicians would like to know if it's corona or not. We don't need to know every cold, every sneeze, is it due to corona? There's no point knowing. Okay, it's there all over the place. So be comfortable about that and say, don't test unnecessarily. Let doctors, when they need to look after patient in a hospital situation, let them test. Okay. Now, luckily, the whole world is involved in it. So even the testing in the aeroplane All those things are just an exercise in futility. So where we go to it, that understand the virus. It is harmless as of now. Not for everybody, I agree. And those people have to take special precaution for themselves. That's the way to go.
You're saying something very important. You're saying that if, let's say, a patient is admitted to a hospital, maybe sometimes even for something else, a hospital or a treating physician can decide whether they need to be tested for Omicron. But routine, random, mandatory testing is no longer necessary, especially if you have no symptoms, not even if you have, let's say, a mild cold. Not necessary.
Yes. And one thing is that certain centers in the country should be earmarked to monitor and sequence these viruses and know where we are going. That is a different story. But don't give this testing as a weapon in the hands of the public health people. They don't need it. You can take for granted in a little while 100% of the virus isolated as corona will be Omicron. So there's no fun in gathering any more sequencing data. Okay, it's rapidly replacing Delta.
You're saying just assume Omicron is here. It's going to be 100% soon of the cases. Testing and isolating no longer has any meaning.
That's right. I said it will be affect. I didn't say it will affect 100% of the people. I said 100% of the positivity
Cases.
will be
Yes.
cases will be Omicron, and the
Yes.
good thing is it will replace Delta completely.
Yes. Now, sir, you advise the government, you're a member of the high level technical body that does. Is the government prepared to accept this? And I ask this because certain very archaic 2020 measures are still being followed. For example, institutional quarantine. I recently interviewed a lady who came back from France who was taken to hospital against her will. She had no symptoms. So, can you not urge the government to have a rethink on all of these things?
Well, when I see the government, I'm surely going to talk to the guy. Now, who is the government? I mean, we all have to collectively make a decision as to how we approach the problem. Now, the point is that we have got certain methods taught to us from the early days of corona. Somehow keep the virus suppressed for what we have not been told. This is the mantra that we meted out with. You know the old saying, if a hammer is the only instrument you have, everything in the world begins to look like a nail. So you just have to repeat the same step, however useless they are. So most COVID infections under the sign of Omicron don't require treatment, don't require hospitalization, and if some of them do require any testing because they have pneumonia-like symptoms, then let the doctors decide. Now, I know in general practice, many people would like to have a little more excitement so that the practice looks good. You look after this virus positive people. Virus positivity is not a disease anymore. You can forget about it. There is no question of eradicating virus. It will do its job and we can't do much about it. So unnecessary testing and isolation, quarantine, all these are really wasteful exercises.
So, for the most part, you would urge those who have no symptoms to not bother testing.
Yes, no symptoms or mild symptom. Do not test yourself. Take it as a cold. It may be Omicron. Doesn't matter. I mean, you'll be all right. Remember, in India's population, mostly are previously infected. On top of that, we have given more than 100 crores of vaccine. Now, we should trust in our ability to defend ourselves now. Otherwise, it is not fair on the people of India.